The morning sun barely touched the hills of Los Angeles when Detective Sarah Morrison received a call that would change everything. Her hands trembled as she gripped the phone, listening to words she never thought she'd hear. After 12 years of legal battles, court orders, and endless paperwork, they finally had permission to open Michael Jackson's private vault. The vault that had remained sealed since his death in 2009. The vault that had sparked countless rumors, conspiracy theories, and wild speculation across the globe. Nobody knew what waited inside those reinforced steel walls, but Sarah knew this moment would either confirm or destroy everything the world thought they knew about the King of Pop. The vault sat beneath Neverland Ranch, hidden in a basement that few people even knew existed. When Sarah arrived at the property with a team of investigators, forensic experts, and legal advisors, the atmosphere felt heavy with anticipation. The ranch itself had fallen into disrepair over the years. Overgrown gardens stretched in every direction. The famous carousel stood silent and rusted. The animals were long gone. But beneath all that decay, something waited. Something that had been protected by layers of security systems, legal protections, and explicit instructions left by Michael himself before his death. Getting to the vault required passing through 3 separate locked doors. Each one demanded different security codes that had been sealed in legal documents for over a decade. The first door opened into a narrow staircase that descended deep underground. The air grew colder with each step. Sarah's breath formed small clouds in front of her face. The second door was solid steel, weighing over 2 tons. It took 4 men and a hydraulic system to move it aside. Behind that door stretched a hallway lined with climate control systems and humidity monitors. Everything designed to preserve whatever lay ahead. The technology looked advanced even by modern standards. Michael had spared no expense in protecting this base. The final door stood before them like a gateway to another world. It was unlike anything Sarah had seen in her 20 years as an investigator. The surface was polished black steel, completely smooth except for a single panel that required both a fingerprint scan and a numerical code. Of course, Michael's fingerprints no longer worked. The legal team had spent months getting override codes from the security company that installed the system. When they finally entered the correct sequence, the door emitted a low mechanical hum. Locks disengaged one by one. The sound echoed through the underground chamber like a countdown. Then, with a rush of pressurized air, the vault door swung open. What greeted them defied explanation. The vault was enormous, roughly the size of a large warehouse. But it wasn't the size that made everyone freeze in their tracks. It was what filled the space. The entire room was divided into sections, each one dedicated to a different aspect of Michael's life and career. But these weren't simple collections of memorabilia or gold records. This was something far more profound, far more unsettling, and far more revealing than anyone could have imagined. Sarah stepped forward slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She could hear her team behind her, their gasps and whispers filling the silence. The first section they encountered contained thousands of notebooks. They lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one carefully labeled with dates spanning from Michael's childhood to just days before his death. Sarah pulled one from 1982 randomly and opened it. The handwriting was small, precise, and filled with detailed observations about music, performance, and the people around him. But it also contained something unexpected. Between the technical notes about dance moves and song lyrics were personal confessions, deep thoughts about loneliness, questions about identity, fears about trust and betrayal. This wasn't just a work journal. This was a window into Michael's innermost thoughts, uncensored and raw. But the notebooks were just a beginning. As Sarah moved deeper into the vault, she discovered walls covered with photographs, not the glamorous shots the public had seen, but candid pictures that told a different story. Photos of Michael alone in empty stadiums after concerts. Images of him sitting by himself in recording studios at 3 a.m. Pictures of him with children from hospitals and orphanages that had never been published. Each photograph was mounted with a small note in Michael's handwriting explaining what he was feeling that day, what he was struggling with, what gave him hope. The collection was massive, containing thousands of images that painted a portrait of a man the world never truly knew. Sarah's attention shifted to a section that appeared to be a small recording studio built right inside the vault. Equipment from various decades filled the space. Reel-to-reel machines sat next to modern digital systems. But what caught everyone's attention were the labeled tapes and hard drives. hundreds of them, each one marked with song titles, dates, and cryptic notes. Some bore titles of songs the world knew well, but with notations like original version or true ending or before they made me change it. Others had titles nobody recognized, songs that were apparently written but never released, performances that were recorded but never shared, a lifetime of creative work that Michael had chosen to keep hidden from the world. The legal team immediately began documenting everything. Cameras flashed as they photographed every corner, every item, every detail. But Sarah couldn't shake a growing feeling of unease. This wasn't just a collection. This was a message. Michael had created this vault knowing that someday someone would open it. He had organized everything with meticulous care, ensuring that whoever found this would understand something important. But what? What was he trying to tell the world? As Sarah stood in the center of that underground chamber, surrounded by the hidden history of one of the most famous men who ever lived, she realized they had only scratched the surface. The real discoveries were still ahead. Dr. Marcus Chen, the audio forensics expert, approached the recording equipment with the reverence of an archaeologist entering an ancient tomb. His specialty was analyzing and restoring old recordings, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this moment. The studio section of the vault contained technology spanning 50 years of music history. Some machines looked like museum pieces. Others were cutting-edge systems that still glowed with power, maintained by automated systems that had kept them functional for over a decade. But it was the sheer volume of recorded material that made Marcus's heart race. If even a fraction of these recordings contained unreleased music, they were standing in the presence of one of the greatest musical discoveries in history. The first tape Marcus examined was labeled simply Thriller Sessions, complete, unedited. Everyone knew Thriller was the best-selling album of all time, but this tape suggested there was more to the story. With trembling hands, Marcus threaded the tape through a wrist-stored reel-to-reel machine. Static crackled through the speakers before music began to flow. The sound quality was pristine, as if the recording had been made yesterday. What they heard was Billie Jean, but not the version the world knew. This version was longer, with an extended introduction that featured Michael's voice explaining his vision for the song. He spoke about feeling watched, judged, accused of things he didn't do. The paranoia in his voice was palpable. Then the music kicked in, and it was different. Raw, more aggressive. The bass line hit harder. Michael's vocals were more intense, almost angry. As the song continued, Michael's voice broke through again between verses. He wasn't just singing. He was telling a story about his life, about fame, about the constant accusations and assumptions people made about him. This wasn't just an alternate version of Billie Jean. This was a confession wrapped in music. The team listened in stunned silence as Michael explained how he'd wanted the song to be a statement about his experience with fame, but the record label had pushed for something more commercial. They'd edited out his spoken parts, softened the edges, made it more palatable for radio. What remained was a masterpiece, but what they were hearing now was something even more powerful. It was art without compromise. Marcus moved to the next recording, this one labeled Dangerous, the real album. His hands shook as he loaded the digital files onto a computer system. The Dangerous album had been controversial, marking a shift in Michael's sound and image. But according to the notes attached to these files, the album the world received was heavily modified. Studio executives had removed songs they deemed too political, too dark, too controversial. Marcus clicked play on the first track, titled The System. What poured through the speakers was unlike anything Michael had ever released publicly. The song was a fierce indictment of the entertainment industry. Michael's lyrics called out racism in the music business, the exploitation of artists, the way fame destroyed lives. His voice carried a rage that had been absent from his public persona. Track after track revealed a side of Michael Jackson the world had never heard. Prison of Gold was a haunting ballad about wealth creating isolation. Innocent until dealt explicitly with false accusations and media manipulation. Child Inside was a painful exploration of losing his childhood to fame. Each song was brilliantly produced, showcasing Michael's musical genius, but the content was darker, more mature, more confrontational than anything he'd been allowed to release. Marcus realized they were listening to the album Michael had wanted to make before it was sanitized for mass consumption. The notes indicated that Michael had fought against the changes but ultimately had to compromise to get the album released at all. But the recordings went far beyond alternate versions of known albums. Marcus discovered entire albums that had never been released. One was titled Reflections, dated from 1995, containing 12 complete songs. The opening track, Mirror Man, was a devastating examination of self-image and identity. Michael sang about not recognizing himself anymore, about changing his appearance to escape pain, about the world making assumptions without understanding the truth. Another song, Grace's Song, was apparently written for his daughter Paris before she was born. It was a promise to protect her from the world that had hurt him, a vow to give her the childhood he never had. The tenderness in Michael's voice made several team members wipe tears from their eyes. Perhaps most shocking was an album labeled Escape Original 2001 version. The world knew a posthumous album called Escape had been released in 2014, but this was something entirely different. The 2001 version contained completely different songs, different production, different themes. One track called Targeted was particularly disturbing. Michael sang about being followed, watched, and deliberately destroyed by people who wanted to silence him. The lyrics mentioned specific instances of surveillance, planted stories in the media, and coordinated efforts to ruin his reputation. Marcus didn't know if Michael was being paranoid or revealing something true, but the conviction in his voice was undeniable. This was an artistic expression. This felt like testimony. Sarah joined Marcus in the studio area, and together they began cataloging the full extent of the recordings. They found demo tape from Michael's childhood with the Jackson 5, including songs that had been rejected by Motown. They discovered collaborations with artists ranging from classical composers to underground hip-hop producers. They found recordings of Michael simply talking, documenting his thoughts and feelings on days when he couldn't express himself through song. Some of these audio diaries were heartbreaking. Michael spoke about feeling trapped by his fame, about not knowing who his real friends were, about fearing for his safety and his children's safety. He talked about wanting to disappear, to start over somewhere as someone else, to experience life as a normal person. One recording particularly troubled Sarah. It was dated June 20th, 2009, just 5 days before Michael's death. His voice sounded exhausted, strained, almost defeated. He spoke about feeling pressure to perform, about not being physically ready for the planned comeback tour, about people around him who seemed more interested in profit than his well-being. He mentioned being given medications he didn't want to take, being pushed when he needed rest, being surrounded by people who wouldn't listen when he said he needed help. The recording ended with Michael saying he was going to document everything, that he was creating this vault as insurance, as protection, as proof. Proof of what? He didn't specify. But the implication was clear. Michael Jackson had known something was wrong. He had known he was in danger. Marcus continued exploring the digital archive and made another startling discovery. Mixed in with the music files were video recordings. Hundreds of hours of footage showing Michael in the studio, working on songs, directing musicians, explaining his creative process. But there were also personal videos. Michael filming himself talking directly to the camera, addressing someone in the future who might find these recordings. In one video, he spoke directly about his legacy, about how he knew the world would remember him but probably wouldn't truly understand him. He asked whoever found these recordings to share them, to let people see the real person behind the headlines and rumors. He wanted the truth known, whatever that truth might reveal. Jennifer Park, the lead investigator for historical documentation, moved to another section of the vault that appeared to be a massive filing system. Metal cabinets lined an entire wall, each drawer precisely labeled with dates, names, and categories. Jennifer had spent her career examining private archives of famous individuals, but she'd never seen anything this comprehensive. Michael Jackson hadn't just kept his creative work. He had documented seemingly every significant interaction, business dealing, and personal relationship throughout his entire life. This wasn't hoarding or paranoia. This was systematic record-keeping on a scale that suggested Michael understood he would need evidence, proof, documentation of his truth versus the narratives others might create. The first cabinet Jennifer opened contained contracts. Not just his recording contracts, though those were there too, but agreements and legal documents spanning decades. Each contract was annotated in Michael's handwriting, with notes pointing out specific clauses, unfair terms, and deceptive language. Jennifer pulled out Michael's first contract with Motown from when he was just 11 years old. His adult handwriting covered the margins, noting how the contract gave him and his brothers almost no right to their own music, how they were paid a fraction of what they generated, how they were essentially locked into servitude. Similar notes appeared on his Epic Records contracts, his merchandising deals, his film agreements. Michael had gone back through his entire career and documented every instance where he felt he'd been exploited or manipulated. But it went deeper than business contracts. Jennifer discovered extensive files on individuals who had worked with or around Michael. These weren't simple personnel records. They were detailed assessments including dates of interactions, conversations, actions, and Michael's personal observations. One thick folder contained documentation about a former manager. Inside were copies of financial statements showing discrepancies in accounting. There were photographs of this person meeting with tabloid journalists. There were transcripts of phone conversations that Michael had apparently recorded. The documentation built a case showing systematic theft and betrayal. Michael had known exactly what was happening, but had documented it rather than immediately confronting it. Jennifer realized he'd been building a case, collecting evidence, protecting himself through information. Sarah joined Jennifer at the filing cabinets, and together they uncovered files that became progressively more disturbing. There were folders documenting Michael's allegations of media harassment, including photographs of paparazzi camped outside his properties, aggressive photographers endangering his children, and tabloid reporters paying his staff for information. Michael had kept copies of false stories published about him alongside the real facts, creating a point-by-point refutation of years of negative press. Some files contained letters he'd written to publications demanding retractions. Most of those letters were never sent, suggesting Michael knew it was futile to fight the media machine. He was simply documenting the truth for posterity. Then Jennifer opened a drawer labeled 1993 to 2005 allegations. Her blood ran cold as she pulled out the contents. This section was massive, containing thousands of pages of documents, recordings, photographs, and evidence related to the accusations that had haunted Michael's later life. Jennifer and Sarah exchanged glances before diving into the material. What they found was a meticulously constructed defense that had apparently never been fully presented publicly. There were financial records showing suspicious patterns of families who had accused Michael, including evidence of prior false accusations against other wealthy individuals. There were recordings of conversations where financial demands were explicitly made before allegations went public. There were statements from witnesses who said they'd been pressured by lawyers and prosecutors to provide damaging testimony. The documentation included psychological evaluations, medical records, and testimony from child psychology experts explaining behaviors that prosecutors had characterized as suspicious. There were letters from dozens of families whose children had spent time with Michael, all stating their complete trust in him and their belief that the allegations were false and financially motivated. Jennifer found detailed timelines showing inconsistencies in accusers' stories, including evidence that alleged events couldn't have occurred when and where claimed because Michael was provably elsewhere. The sheer volume of exculpatory evidence was staggering. Yet, according to Michael's notes, much of this had never been presented effectively in court or in the media because his legal teams had made strategic decisions to settle or to limit their defense to avoid dragging out proceedings. One document particularly caught Sarah's attention. It was a handwritten letter from Michael dated December 2003, shortly after his arrest on child molestation charges. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone specific. It read like a message to history. In it, Michael wrote about his disbelief being falsely accused, about the impossibility of proving innocence when the accusations themselves were enough to destroy him. He wrote about considering suicide, about feeling the world would be better off without him, about the only thing keeping him alive being his children. But he also wrote about his determination to document everything, to create this vault as a testament to the truth. He knew he might not live to see his reputation restored, but he wanted the evidence preserved for a time when people might be willing to see it. Jennifer moved to another section containing medical records. These weren't just routine doctor visits. These were extensive files documenting Michael's physical and mental health throughout his life. The records painted a picture of a man in constant pain. There were treatment notes for injuries sustained during performances, including severe burn from the Pepsi commercial accident in 1984 that had resulted in chronic pain and multiple surgeries. There were prescriptions for pain medications dating back decades, showing a pattern of increasing dependence that corresponded with increasing physical trauma. Contrary to public narratives about addiction and self-destruction, these records suggested Michael's medication use was tied directly to legitimate medical issues that had been inadequately treated. The psychological evaluations were equally revealing. Multiple therapists and psychiatrists had diagnosed Michael with severe anxiety, PTSD from childhood trauma, and body dysmorphic disorder. The records indicated that Michael's changing appearance wasn't vanity or an attempt to look white, as the media had claimed. It was a psychological condition triggered by years of his father criticizing his appearance and the entertainment industry reinforcing that criticism. The treatments recommended by mental health professionals had been consistent: regular therapy, reduced work stress, distance from toxic relationships. But notes from Michael indicated he'd been unable to follow these recommendations because of contractual obligations, financial pressures, and the constant demands of maintaining his career. Sarah discovered another category of files labeled threats. Inside were police reports, threatening letters, evidence of stalkers, and documentation of numerous death threats Michael had received over the years. Some threats were racially motivated. Others came from people claiming Michael had stolen their music or owed them money. Still others were from individuals with clear delusions about having relationships with Michael. The volume was overwhelming. Yet, according to note from Michael's security team, law enforcement had often been dismissive of these threats, suggesting that fame came with such problems and Michael should simply accept them. Several files contained evidence of actual attempts to harm Michael, including break-ins at his properties, packages containing suspicious substances, and confrontations with aggressive individuals. Michael had lived under constant threat, yet the world saw him as a strange, eccentric one. Jennifer found personnel files on everyone who had worked closely with Michael in his final years. These files were particularly detailed, including background checks, financial investigations, and notes about behavior Michael found suspicious. One file on his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, was especially troubling. Michael had documented concerns about Murray's medical practices, his financial desperation, and pressure Murray had applied to prescribe stronger medications. There were notes indicating Michael felt he couldn't refuse because he needed medical clearance to perform, and Murray was willing to provide it. The file suggested Michael had been aware of the danger but felt trapped between his need to fulfill contractual obligations and his deteriorating health. Reading these files, Sarah realized Michael might have documented the circumstances that would ultimately lead to his death. Detective Tom Richardson approached what appeared to be a living space within the vault. Unlike the archival sections they'd explored, this area had been designed for comfort. There was a bed, a small kitchen area, chairs, and even a television. The space was modest, almost monastic in its simplicity. Tom realized this wasn't just a storage vault. Michael had created a refuge, a place where he could escape the world entirely. The bed looked like it had been used. There were personal items on the nightstand, reading glasses, books, a journal. This was a space Michael had actually lived in, at least temporarily. The thought of one of the most famous people in the world hiding in an underground vault to find peace was profoundly sad. The books on the shelves revealed unexpected interests. There were volumes on philosophy, particularly works dealing with identity, perception, and reality. Books on childhood psychology and trauma. Biographies of other famous people who had struggled with fame. Religious texts from multiple traditions, all heavily annotated with Michael's thoughts and questions. Medical textbooks about pain management and sleep disorders. The reading material painted a picture of someone trying to understand himself, his condition, and his place in the world. These weren't the books of someone lost in shallow celebrity. These were the books of someone engaged in deep, ongoing self-examination. Tom opened the journal on the nightstand. The entries were dated from various years, suggesting Michael had written in the specific journal whenever he stayed in the vault. The writings were raw and unfiltered. In one entry from 1996, Michael wrote about bringing his son Prince to Neverland and feeling overwhelming joy watching him play, but also terrible fear about whether he could protect his children from cruelty he'd experienced. Another entry from 2003, during his trial, expressed such profound despair that Tom had difficulty reading it. Michael wrote about the trial destroying his spirit, about feeling violated by the court proceedings, about wondering if he would survive the experience. He questioned whether his life had any meaning if everything he'd built could be destroyed by lies. But there were also entries filled with hope and determination. After his 2005 acquittal, Michael wrote about his gratitude for the jury's verdict and his determination to rebuild his life and career. He wrote about his love for his children, about wanting to create beautiful music again, about his plans for the future. These entries showed resilience and strength. Yet the later entries, from 2008 and 2009, revealed that pressure building again. Michael wrote about the This Is It concert series with mixed feelings. He was excited to perform again, but terrified he wasn't physically ready. He felt pressured by people around him who needed the concerts to happen for financial reasons. He wrote about feeling like a machine being turned back on, regardless of whether the machine was ready to function. Sarah joined Tom in the living area and noticed something he'd missed. Behind a curtain was a small workspace with a computer, monitors, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. The computer was surprisingly modern, with systems still running on backup power. Sarah carefully accessed the system and found encrypted files. It took their tech specialists several hours to break the encryption, but what they found was stunning. Michael had been monitoring media coverage of himself across multiple platforms. He had software tracking every article, every television segment, every online comment. He'd been documenting the patterns of negative coverage, noting when false stories appeared, identifying which outlets consistently published damaging material, and tracking connections between those outlets and people in his business orbit. The surveillance went further. Michael had apparently employed private investigators to research people he suspected of working against him. The files contained background checks on certain journalists who wrote particularly damaging stories, financial connections between tabloid publications and individuals in the music industry who competed with Michael, and evidence of coordinated campaigns to damage his reputation. One file suggested a competitor had actually paid tabloids to publish false stories during a period when Michael was negotiating to buy music publishing rights they both wanted. The scheme had worked, forcing Michael to abandon the deal due to damaged reputation. Michael had documented all of it, but apparently never used the information publicly. He was collecting evidence of conspiracies against him, even as the world called him paranoid. Jennifer called everyone to another section she'd discovered. This area appeared to be a shrine to Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson. Photograph of her covered the walls, spanning from her youth to recent years. There were letters Michael had written to her but never sent, expressing his love, his guilt about the life his fame had created for their family, and his gratitude for her faith in him. There were recordings of her voice, apparently just phone conversations Michael had saved. The most touching item was a video Michael had made for her, dated just weeks before his death. In it, he spoke directly to her, telling her how much he loved her, apologizing for the worry he'd caused her, and expressing his hope that she would be proud of his planned comeback. He promised he would make everything right, would prove all the critics wrong, would show the world he was still the greatest performer alive. But there was another family section that was starkly different. Files on Michael's father, Joseph Jackson, contained a very different tone. There were no loving letters here. Instead, there were therapy notes documenting abuse Michael suffered as a child. There were recordings Michael had made describing incidents of physical violence, psychological manipulation, and harsh criticism that had shaped his childhood. There were statements from siblings confirming these experiences. Michael had documented the trauma systematically, as if he needed proof of what he'd endured. In one particularly painful document, Michael had written a letter to his father that was never sent. In it, he explained how the abuse had affected every aspect of his life, his relationships, his self-image, his ability to trust. He ended the letter not with anger but with sadness, saying he forgave his father but could never forget or pretend it didn't matter. Tom discovered another area dedicated to Michael's children. This section was different from all the others. It was filled with love, hope, and normal parental concerns. There were videos of Prince, Paris, and Blanket playing, laughing, learning. Michael had recorded hundreds of hours of seemingly mundane family moments. Birthday parties, bedtime stories, trips to the park. In voiceover on many of these videos, Michael spoke about his determination to give his children the childhood he never had. He talked about protecting them from the media, from exploitation, from the darkness of fame. There were also letters written to each child to be opened on their 18th birthdays. The investigators agreed these should remain sealed until the appropriate time, but Michael had labeled them clearly, "The truth about your father from your father." The most unusual discovery in the personal section was what appeared to be a costume room. Racks held iconic outfits from Michael's career: the red leather jacket from Thriller, the black and gold jacket from the Dangerous Tour, military-style outfits from award shows, and the fedora and single white glove that had become his trademarks. But each costume had a tag attached with notes about what Michael was feeling when he wore it, what the outfit meant to him, why he'd chosen specific elements. These weren't just costumes. They were armor. Michael wrote about how his stage persona was a character he created to protect his real self. When he put on those clothes, he became the Michael Jackson the world expected. When he took them off, he was someone else entirely, someone vulnerable and uncertain. The costumes represented the divide between public Michael and private Michael, between the performance and the person. Sarah stood in the center of the living area, trying to process everything they'd discovered. This vault wasn't just a storage facility. It was a complete record of a human being's existence, preserved with meticulous care. Michael Jackson had documented his life knowing that the public narrative was incomplete and often false. He created this space as a counter-narrative, a place where the truth could be preserved even if it couldn't be spoken while he was alive. But Sarah felt a growing sense of urgency. They'd been in the vault for hours, and she knew they still hadn't found everything. The deepest secret, she suspected, was still waiting to be discovered. The investigative team had been working for 2 days straight, cataloging the contents of Michael Jackson's vault. They were exhausted, overwhelmed, and emotionally drained from the discoveries. But there was one section they hadn't yet fully explored. At the very back of the vault, separated by a final locked door, was a room that could only be opened with a code hidden in Michael's personal journal. Sarah had found the code embedded in what appeared to be a poem. When she entered the numbers, the door opened into a smaller, more intimate space. This was clearly the heart of the vault, the place where Michael had kept his most private, most important secrets. The room was surprisingly simple. A single chair faced a large screen on the wall. On a table beside the chair sat a computer with a note attached. The note was in Michael's handwriting, dated June 24th, 2009, the day before he died. Sarah's hands trembled as she read it aloud to her team. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Everything in this vault is my truth. I've spent my life being defined by others, judged by people who never knew me, loved and hated by millions who only knew the image. This final room contains a complete story. Watch these videos. Share them or don't. But know that I tried to leave the truth behind." Sarah looked at her team. Everyone nodded. They needed to see this. She pressed play on the computer. The screen illuminated with Michael's face. He looked tired, older than his 50 years, but his eyes were clear and focused. "My name is Michael Joseph Jackson," he began. "This is my testimony." For the next several hours, the team watched and listened as Michael told his complete story in his own words. He started with his childhood, describing not just the abuse and exploitation, but also the joy he'd found in music, the bond with his brothers, and the moment he realized he had a gift that could move people. He spoke candidly about the price of that gift. He described what it felt like to never have privacy, to be treated as a commodity rather than a person, to be famous before he was old enough to understand what fame meant. Michael addressed the controversies that had defined his public image. He spoke about his changing appearance with painful honesty. He explained the skin condition vitiligo that had started in the early 80s, causing patches of depigmentation that he'd initially tried to cover with makeup. As it progressed, the uneven appearance became harder to hide, so doctors recommended depigmentation treatment to even his skin tone. It wasn't a choice to become white. It was a medical solution to a medical condition. He showed medical records and photographs documenting the progression of the condition. He became emotional talking about how the world accused him of hating his race when in fact he'd been dealing with a disease that robbed him of control over his own appearance. The accusations had been devastating, adding psychological trauma to physical illness. He addressed the plastic surgery with equal candor. Yes, he'd had procedures done, but not nearly as many as people claimed. The initial rhinoplasty was after he broke his nose. Subsequent procedures were attempts to fix issues with the first surgery. His changing appearance was mostly due to vitiligo, weight loss from stress and performing, and simply aging. But the media created a narrative of a man obsessed with surgery, and every change was attributed to more operations. Michael explained how this narrative fed into broader attacks on his character, painting him as unstable and self-hating. He wished he'd addressed it publicly earlier, but his private nature and his doctor's advice had led him to stay silent. That silence had been a mistake that fed the rumors. Then Michael addressed the most painful topic, the allegations of child abuse. He became visibly emotional, his voice breaking as he spoke. He explained his love for children came from his stolen childhood, his desire to give kids a joy and innocence he'd never experienced. Neverland Ranch had been built as a refuge for sick children, underprivileged kids, and young people who needed escape from harsh realities. He'd hosted thousands of children and their families over the years. The vast majority of those experiences had been beautiful and innocent, but some people had seen opportunity in his generosity. Michael walked through the allegations systematically, providing evidence and context that had never been fully presented publicly. He showed financial records proving that families had made monetary demands before going public. He played recorded conversations where lawyers discussed settlement amounts. He presented testimony from children who'd later recanted, stating they'd been coached by parents and attorneys. Michael didn't deny that his behavior could appear strange to outsiders. He acknowledged sleeping in the same room as children during sleepovers, though he clarified that while he sometimes slept on the floor and kids slept in the bed, the arrangement was innocent and usually involved multiple children and sometimes their parents. He recognized that in retrospect, he should have been more careful about appearances. His naivety and his genuine love for children had made him vulnerable to exploitation by people who saw him as an opportunity for money. The settlements had been business decisions made by insurance companies and lawyers against his wishes. He'd wanted to fight every case, but the cost of his career, his family, and his health had made fighting impossible. The 2005 trial, which resulted in acquittal on all counts, had vindicated him legally but destroyed him personally. The videos continued with Michael discussing his final years. He talked about his financial struggles, explaining how despite earning billions during his career, bad business deals, expensive lifestyle, legal fees, and supporting extended family had left him with significant debt. The This Is It concerts were meant to solve those problems and re-establish his career. But Michael admitted he wasn't physically or emotionally ready. He was sleeping only a few hours a night, struggling with chronic pain, and feeling tremendous pressure from everyone around him who had financial stakes in the concerts happening. He discussed Dr. Conrad Murray with surprising clarity. He stated that Murray was giving him propofol, a powerful anesthetic, to sleep. Michael knew it was dangerous. He knew it was inappropriate. But he felt trapped between needing rest and needing to be ready to perform. In perhaps the most chilling segment, Michael looked directly into the camera and said, "If something happens to me, it's not an accident. I'm worth more dead than alive to certain people. My music catalog, my image rights, my estate will be worth billions. I'm not suicidal. I love my children more than anything. If I die under suspicious circumstances, investigate thoroughly. Don't accept simple explanations." He didn't name specific people or make explicit accusations, but the implication was clear. Michael believed people around him prioritized profit over his well-being, and he feared the ultimate consequence of that priority. Sarah felt chills run down her spine. This video was recorded 5 days before Michael's death from a propofol overdose administered by Dr. Murray, who was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The final video segment showed a different side of Michael. His mood lifted as he talked about his hopes and dreams. He spoke about wanting to do more humanitarian work, to use his wealth and influence to help children globally. He discussed plans for new music that would address social issues, return to his roots, and prove he was still creative and relevant. He talked about eventually retiring from performing to focus on producing, directing, and mentoring young artists. He wanted to write books, make films, create art beyond music. His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as he described these plans. It was heartbreaking knowing none of it would happen. In his final words on the video, Michael looked at the camera and said, "I hope I'm wrong about everything. I hope I live to be an old man, watching my grandchildren play. But if not, if this is my message to the future, then please understand, I was human, flawed, complicated, damaged, but also creative, loving, and trying my best. Judge me by my work, by my humanitarian efforts, by the joy I tried to bring to the world. Don't judge me by the headlines."